The wind in the Sweetwater Valley did not blow so much as it scoured. It was a living thing, a relentless, invisible hand that sanded down the edges of the mountains and the spirits of the people who tried to live beneath them. It was late in the summer of 1878, and the valley was gasping for rain. The earth had cracked open in hexagonal patterns, looking like the thirsty skin of a reptile, and the dust hung suspended in the air, turning the midday sun into a hazy, bloodshot eye. Far to the west, the peaks of the Absaroka Range held on to their snow, white and indifferent, mocking the parched plains below with a promise of water that never seemed to reach the valley floor. Clara Talcott woke before the sun, as she had done every morning for 2 years. The room was gray and still, the air trapped inside the thick log walls feeling stale compared to the wild, restless atmosphere outside. Beside her, Henry slept with the stillness of a soldier, lying flat on his back, his breathing rhythmic and controlled, even in sleep. Her husband took up space with an authority that made Clara curl closer to the edge of the mattress. She rose, quietly, the floorboards cold against her bare feet. By the time the first bruised purple light of dawn touched the horizon, Clara was already outside, the heavy wooden handle of the water bucket cutting into her palm. The pump groaned in protest, a metal shriek that tore through the morning silence, before spitting out a stream of clear, cold water. Clara paused, wiping a stray lock of hair from her forehead with the back of her wrist. She looked out over the Talcott Ranch, a modest spread that Henry had carved out of the sagebrush with sheer force of will. It was not a large kingdom, but it was theirs. Or rather, it was his. She hauled the water to the chicken coop, her shoulders aching with a dull, familiar throb. The hens clucked and scattered as she tossed the feed, their erratic movements the only chaos allowed in Henry Talcott's world. As she worked, Clara thought about the silence. It was not just the absence of noise, it was a weight. Before she married Henry, she had been a schoolteacher's daughter in a town 3 days' ride east, surrounded by books and the chatter of children. She had thought marriage would be a partnership, a joining of lives. Instead, it felt like she had been absorbed into a machine that required constant maintenance but offered no conversation. She was 28 years old, and she often felt as dry and hollow as the creek bed behind the barn. Henry emerged from the house as she was coming back up the porch steps. He was a man composed of hard angles and stiff leather, in his mid-40s. Henry carried the legacy of the Civil War in his left knee, which stiffened when the weather turned, and in his eyes, which were the color of slate and just as unyielding. He did not smile when he saw her. He nodded, a sharp, singular motion. "Coffee is ready," Clara said, holding the door open. Henry stepped past her, smelling of shaving soap and tobacco. "Good," he said. "We have a long day." Breakfast was an affair of utility. They ate salt pork and biscuits in a silence that was broken only by the scrape of forks against tin plates. Henry ate with precision, wasting nothing, his mind always 3 steps ahead on the ranch's schedule. When he finally pushed his plate away, he did not reach for her hand. He reached for his ledger. "I have decided on the fence," Henry announced. Clara paused, the coffee pot hovering over his cup. The fence again. It had been a topic of muttering for months, but Henry spoke now with the tone of a judge delivering a verdict. "The entire east line," Henry continued, looking at his own handwriting in the book. "I ordered the wire from the mercantile in town. We pick it up today. Cedar posts every 10 feet. 3 strands. Clara set the pot down carefully. "Henry, that is 5 miles of fencing. The neighbors, the grazing rights are open. The Lawtons run their herd through the creek bottom. The Lawtons let their cattle mix with strays," Henry said, his voice dropping an octave, tightening. "And I will not have my herd mingling with scrub stock, nor will I have drifters thinking they can camp on my land, lighting fires and stealing what does not belong to them. It is open range." "Henry," she said softly. "It is my land," he corrected, his eyes snapping up to meet hers, "and I intend to keep it that way. The territory is changing. Clara, it is filling up with trash. Men who lost everything in the war and never found the gumption to build it back. They drift through like locusts. We need boundaries. A man survives by what he can control. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. It was the way he said, control. He looked at the land the way he looked at his ledger. And sometimes she feared the way he looked at her, as an asset to be managed, protected, and fenced in. "We are going to town," Henry said, standing up and putting on his hat. "Be ready in 20 minutes. The ride into Cottonwood took 2 hours. The wagon rattled and jumped over the ruts, the iron wheels grinding against the hard-packed earth. Clara sat straight-backed on the bench seat beside Henry, her hands folded in her lap, watching the heat shimmer rise off the sagebrush. The town of Cottonwood was growing, an ugly scar of timber and brick expanding into the dust. It was a place where civilization was trying desperately to take root, but the wildness of the territory kept clawing it back. As they rolled down the main street, Clara saw the lines drawn as clearly as any fence. On the boardwalks, the respectable women walked in pairs, their skirts dusting the planks, parasols up against the sun. They were the wives of merchants and established ranchers, women who wore their morality like armor. In the muddy street, cowhands rode ragged horses, men with sun-bleached shirts and hats pulled low, drifting between the livery stable and the saloons. Henry steered the wagon toward the general store, his expression sour as he navigated around a group of laughing cowboys. "Look at them," Henry muttered. "Useless. They drink their wages and sleep in the dirt. They are just boys, mostly," Clara said, though she kept her voice low. "They are trouble," Henry replied. He brought the wagon to a halt in front of Miller's Mercantile. "You get the flour and the coffee," Henry instructed. "I have to go to the freight office to sign for the wire. Do not linger. Clara, I want to be back before dusk." Clara stepped down, the dust puffing around her boots. She watched Henry walk away, his stride uneven but determined, before she pushed open the door to the store. A bell jingled overhead, a cheerful sound that seemed out of place in the heavy atmosphere. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of roasted coffee beans, pickle brine, and new calico. 2 women stood near the fabric counter, fingering a bolt of blue wool. Clara recognized them immediately. Mrs. Gable, the banker's wife, and Mrs. Miller, who ran the store with her husband. They were the arbiters of Cottonwood society, the keepers of the list of who was decent and who was not. "Good morning," Clara said, moving toward the dry goods. "Mrs." Gable turned, her smile tight and brief. "Why?" "Clara Talcott. We have not seen you in weeks. Henry keeps you busy out there." "There is always work," Clara said. "Finding a sack of sugar." "Mrs." Miller leaned over the counter. "We were just saying how blessed Mary O'Connell is. Did you hear? Her 3rd baby is coming in the spring. And that husband of hers, building that new nursery room already. A strong man, providing like that." Clara felt the sting of it, sharp and precise. "That is wonderful news," she said, keeping her back to them as she inspected a tin of tea. "It is a blessing." "Mrs." Gable agreed, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that was meant to be heard. "It is a shame. Really, some women are just naturally meant for it, and others, well, the Lord has his reasons. Perhaps it is the isolation." "Mrs." Miller suggested, her tone dripping with faux sympathy. "It cannot be good for a woman's constitution, being out there with no one but a husband who works from dark to dark. It withers the spirit. And when the spirit is withered, the womb follows." Clara gripped the tin of tea until her knuckles turned white. She focused on the label, reading the black letters over and over without comprehending them. "Choice black tea. Choice black tea." She wanted to turn around and scream that she was not withered, that she was made of blood and bone and longing. But the training of her life held her fast. She was a lady. She was Henry Talcott's wife. She did not make scenes. She gathered her items quickly, placing them on the counter with a steady hand. "Just these, please, Mrs." Miller rang up the total, $2.40. Clara. Clara paid and walked out, the bell jingling cheerfully behind her, mocking the sudden emptiness in her chest. She stepped out onto the boardwalk, gasping for air that didn't smell of judgment. The sun was high now, punishingly hot. She walked back toward the wagon, her eyes stinging. Henry was not there yet. The street was busy. A group of men were gathered near the livery stable, laughing at a dog chasing its own tail. Clara moved to load the supplies into the back of the wagon, her mind still replaying the women's whispers. Something wrong with her. She hoisted the heavy sack of flour, her distraction making her clumsy. She set it down too hard near the tailgate, and the wagon shifted. She had not set the brake firmly enough. The heavy vehicle groaned and rolled backward a few inches, just enough for the rear wheel to slide into a deep, dried-out rut in the street with a jarring thud. "Oh no," Clara breathed. She looked around. The wheel was wedged tight. If Henry came back and saw this, saw that she had been careless, he would not shout. He never shouted. He would just look at her with that disappointed silence that was worse than a backhand. She grabbed the spokes of the wheel, trying to heave it forward, but the wagon was heavy, laden with the rest of their supplies. She strained, her boots slipping in the dust, sweat pricking at her hairline. "Easy there, ma'am. You will hurt yourself before you move that oak." The voice was low, warm, and sounded like gravel tumbling over velvet. Clara let go of the wheel and turned. Standing a few feet away was a man she had not noticed by the livery. He was younger than Henry, perhaps 30, but his face carried the map of a life lived without a roof. His skin was the color of cured tobacco, burnished by the wind and sun. He wore a faded blue shirt, dust-caked denim trousers, and a hat that had seen 1,000 storms. But it was his face that held her. A jagged, pale scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into his collar, a violent mark on a calm face. He was not looking at her dress or her hair. He was looking at her eyes. He stepped forward, moving with a fluid grace that seemed at odds with his rough appearance. "Step back," he said gently. Clara moved aside. The cowboy bent his knees, gripping the rim of the wheel and the bed of the wagon. He did not grunt or make a show of it. He simply exhaled and pushed, his shoulder muscles bunching under the thin fabric of his shirt. The wagon groaned, rose, and rolled forward out of the rut. He held it steady with one hand while he kicked a large stone behind the wheel to chalk it. Then he straightened up, dusting his hands on his trousers. "That hole has caught 3 wagons this week," he said, looking at her. "The town council ought to fill it, but they are too busy arguing about taxes." Clara felt a strange, sudden inability to speak. "Thank you," she managed finally. I did not set the brake hard enough. It happens," he said. He did not dismiss her. He stood there, waiting, as if he had all the time in the world. His eyes were a startling, clear hazel, speckled with green. When he looked at her, Clara felt a physical jolt, a warm shock that started in her stomach and rose to her throat. It was the sensation of being seen, not as a wife, not as a barren woman, not as a chore to be managed, but as a person standing in the dust. "I am Eli," he said. "Eli Mercer." "I am Clara," she said, and then added quickly, "Mrs. Talcott." Eli's eyes flickered to the wedding band on her finger, then back to her face. He tipped his hat, a slow, deliberate gesture, a pleasure. "Mrs. Talcott." The moment stretched, thin and taut as a wire. Clara realized she was leaning slightly toward him, drawn by the gravity of his stillness. "What is this?" The voice cut through the air like a whip crack. Henry was striding toward them, his face darkened by the shadow of his hat brim. He looked from the wagon to Eli, his eyes narrowing into slits. "The wheel slipped," Clara said quickly, stepping between the 2 men. "Mr. Mercer was kind enough to help me." Henry stopped 3 feet from Eli. He looked the younger man up and down, taking in the worn boots, the scar, the lack of property evident in his posture. Henry's lip curled slightly. "We do not need help from strangers," Henry said coldly. Eli did not flinch. He did not look down, as men usually did when Henry Talcott spoke. He held Henry's gaze. "Just lending a hand. Friend, No charge for it. I am not your friend, Henry snapped, and I can manage my own wagon. Move along. Eli looked at Henry for a long second. Then his gaze shifted to Clara. For the briefest moment, his expression softened. A silent communication that she felt in her marrow. He nodded once, then turned and walked away toward the saloon, his spurs chiming softly in the dirt. Another stray looking for trouble, Henry muttered. Watching him go, he turned to Clara, his concern instantly replaced by irritation. Get in the wagon. Clara, I have the wire. We are burning daylight. Clara climbed onto the seat, her heart hammering against her ribs. She watched Eli Mercer's back as he disappeared into the shadow of the saloon porch. She felt flushed, her skin prickling. The ride home was grueling. The wagon was heavier now, loaded with spools of barbed wire that rattled and clanked with every bump. The sound was metallic and angry. Henry drove with a focused intensity, muttering about the cost of the posts and the incompetence of the freight clerk. Clara said nothing. She watched the horizon. That evening, the ranch was swallowed by the vast, oppressive dark of the prairie. The wind had picked up, whistling through the chinking of the log walls. Henry sat at the heavy oak table in the center of the main room. He had cleared away the dinner plates and unrolled a large sheet of paper. A kerosene lamp burned in the center, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. Clara sat in her rocking chair by the cold fireplace, mending a tear in Henry's work shirt. She watched him. He had placed a handful of small stones on the corners of the paper to hold it flat. Here, Henry said, tapping the paper with a thick finger. We start at the creek. We run the line north to the ridge, then cut west to the canyon drop-off. He looked up at her, his face illuminated by the yellow light. It makes sense. Clara, you see that, don't you? I see it. Henry, she said quietly. It will keep the cattle in, he said, his voice taking on that fervent, almost religious tone he used when discussing ranch business. And it will keep the trash out. Mercer, men like that, they think the world is free for the taking. They do not understand that a man has to bleed for what he owns. He looked back down at the map, tracing the invisible barrier with his finger. We will have peace. Clara, once the fence is up, we will have peace. Clara looked at the needle in her hand. She thought of the 5 miles of wire. She thought of the sharp barbs that would catch the wind and sing. Henry was building a fortress. He called it safety. But from where she sat, in the dim light of a house that had no children and no laughter, it looked like a cage. She closed her eyes and, unbidden, the image of the afternoon returned to her. She felt the ghost of the sensation, the heavy wagon lifting as if it weighed nothing. She saw the dust on the blue shirt. She saw the scar on the jaw that spoke of violence survived. And she saw the eyes. Eli Mercer. He was out there somewhere in the dark. On the other side of the line, Henry was drawing on the table. A drifter. A stray. A man who belonged to the wind. Clara pricked her finger with the needle. A tiny bead of bright red blood welled up. She put her finger to her mouth, tasting the copper, and wondered why the memory of a stranger's steady hands made her chest ache with a sudden, terrible longing for something she could not name. Henry picked up a pencil and drew a thick, black line across the paper, severing the ranch from the rest of the world. It starts tomorrow, he said. Yes, Clara whispered to the empty room. It starts tomorrow. The cedar posts went into the ground like tomb markers. For 3 days, the rhythm of the ranch had been the dull, hollow thud of the post-hole digger striking the earth and the sharper, ringing crack of the hammer driving staples into wood. The sun was a white hammer in the sky, beating down on the Sweetwater Valley with a cruelty that felt personal. It was not yet noon, but the heat was already rising in shimmering waves off the hard pan, distorting the horizon until the distant mountains looked like they were melting into the sky. Clara Talcott walked the line of the fresh-dug holes, her gloved hands gripping the rough bark of a cedar post. She dragged it forward, the wood leaving a serpentine trail in the dust, and dropped it beside the next black gap in the earth. Her shoulders burned with a dull fire. Her dress, a sensible calico that had once been bright blue but was now bleached to the color of a hazy sky, clung to her back, soaked through with sweat. Henry was 50 yards ahead. working the wire stretcher. He was a machine of leverage and grunt. He clamped the iron jaws of the tool onto the double-strand barbed wire, the devil's rope, the locals called it, and cranked it tight. The wire sang a high, deadly note as it pulled taut, slicing through the air. "Keep them coming." "Clara," Henry called out. He did not turn around. His voice was tight, strained by the effort and the dust coating his throat. "We lose the light. We lose the day." Clara wiped her forehead with her sleeve, leaving a streak of dirt across her brow. She looked back at the line they had finished. It was an ugly thing. The raw wood of the posts looked like a scar against the sagebrush, and the glinting steel wire severed the continuity of the rolling hills. Before this week, the land had flowed like a dry ocean, rolling from their porch all the way to the jagged spine of the Absarokas. Now, there was a here and a there. There was ours and theirs. She hefted another post, the weight of it settling into the ache in her lower back. As she walked, she looked out past the boundary they were building. The open range was vast, a sea of brown grass and gray sage, dotted here and there with the dark shapes of grazing cattle. Movement caught her eye on a distant ridge. It was a group of riders, silhouettes against the blinding sky. They were pushing a small herd of strays toward the water pocket in the lower creek. Even at this distance, Clara recognized the way one of them sat his horse. He did not hunch or bounce. He moved with the animal, fluid and easy, as if he and the sorrel gelding were cut from the same piece of living rock. Eli Mercer. She stopped, the cedar post resting against her hip. She watched him ride. He was free in a way she could barely comprehend. He owned nothing but his saddle and his bedroll, Henry had said with disdain. But in that moment, Clara felt a sharp, twisting envy that nearly brought her to her knees. He could turn his horse and ride until the ocean if he chose. He was subject to the wind and the rain, yes, but he was not subject to the crushing geometry of fences and ledgers. "Clara!" Henry's voice snapped her back. "The wire is waiting." She turned away from the ridge, feeling a hollow ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the heavy lifting. It was the ache of a bird watching the sky through the bars of a cage it had helped to build. By mid-afternoon, the heat was suffocating. The wind had died, leaving the air heavy and still. They were working on a difficult section where the ground was rocky, fighting for every inch of depth for the posts. Clara was holding the wire spool, feeding the lethal strand toward Henry. The barbs were sharp, clustered in vicious little knots every 5 inches. Henry was in a foul mood. The heat was making his bad knee seize up, and he was taking it out on the tools, wrenching the stretcher with violent jerks. "Hold it steady," he commanded. "Do not let it slack." "I am trying." "Henry?" Clara said, her voice thin. She gripped the wire, her leather gloves slick with sweat. Henry gave a sudden, hard crank on the stretcher. The wire jumped, snapping taut with the violence of a whip crack. Clara gasped. The wire jerked in her hands, and a barb caught the leather of her glove, tearing through it and slicing deep into the fleshy part of her palm near the thumb. She cried out, dropping the wire. It coiled back like a striking snake. "Damn it!" "Clara!" Henry shouted, not turning to look at her, focused only on the tension he had lost. "You have to hold it tight or the line sags. I am bleeding." "Henry!" she said, clutching her hand to her chest. Henry turned then, his face flushed and streaked with dirt. He looked at her hand, where a bright red bloom was spreading rapidly across the dirty leather. He let out a short, frustrated breath. "Wrap it up," he said, though his voice softened a fraction. "Go to the wagon and wrap it." "I cannot stop now. The tension is set. If I let go, the whole strand unravels." Clara nodded, biting her lip to keep the tears back. It was not the pain of the cut that hurt. It was the fact that the fence mattered more. She turned and stumbled away from the line, toward the wagon parked in the shade of a lone cottonwood tree some distance away. She did not make it to the wagon. As she crossed the line of the fence, stepping over the bottom wire that was already strung, a shadow fell over her. She looked up. Startled, a horse was standing on the other side of the fence, close enough that she could smell the animal's sweat and dust. Eli Mercer sat in the saddle, looking down at her. He had ridden closer than the neighboring ranch hands usually did, right up to the very edge of the disputed line. He did not smile. His face was grave, his eyes shadowed by the brim of his hat. He looked at her hand, clutching her chest, the blood dripping onto her apron. "You hurt yourself," he said. It was not a question. Clara stepped back, her heart hammering a sudden, frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Just a scratch," she said, her voice trembling. "The wire." It slipped. Eli swung down from his horse. He moved with a quiet economy, his boots hitting the earth with a soft thud. He walked to the fence, the 3 strands of wire separating them. He did not cross it, but he leaned over the top post, reaching into his saddlebag. "Barbed wire is nasty business," he said softly. "It tears rather than cuts. It gets infected if you look at it wrong." He pulled out a clean, folded piece of white cotton cloth. It looked startlingly bright against his dust-covered shirt. "Here," he said, extending his hand through the gap between the top and middle wires. "Take this. It is clean. I washed it in the creek this morning." Clara hesitated. She could hear the clank creak of Henry's work down the line, if he saw her talking to the drifter, but the blood was warm and sticky on her skin. She stepped forward, drawn by the genuine concern in Eli's voice. She reached out with her good hand and took the cloth. His fingers brushed hers, rough, calloused, warm, and for a second, the world seemed to narrow down to that point of contact. He did not pull his hand away immediately. He looked at her, his hazel eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that stripped away her defenses. There was no judgment in his face, only a quiet recognition of her pain. "Wrap it tight," he instructed gently, "and wash it with whiskey when you get home. It will sting, but it keeps the fever out." "Thank you," Clara whispered. "Why is he here?" Henry's voice was a rough bark. Clara jumped, clutching the cloth to her chest. Henry was striding toward them, his hammer gripped in his right hand like a weapon. He walked with a heavy, uneven gait, his anger propelling him forward. Eli straightened up, slowly removing his hand from the space between the wires. He tipped his hat to Henry, his expression shifting from concern to a guarded neutrality. "Afternoon." "Talcott." Henry stopped 5 feet from the fence. He looked at Eli, then at the horse, then at Clara. "You are crowding the line." "Mercer," Henry spat. "This is Talcott land. The survey marker is right there by your horse's hoof." "I am not on your land," Eli said calmly. "I am standing on the open range, and your wife is bleeding." "I can tend to my own wife," Henry said, his face darkening. "And I can tend to my own lines. We do not need the double bar K checking on our progress." "I was just riding fence for the boss," Eli said, "checking for drift." "Drift," Henry repeated, a sneer curling his lip. "That is what you call it. I call it looking for a gap. I know how you boys operate. You let the cattle push against the line until it breaks, then claim ignorance when they eat my grass." Eli's jaw tightened, the scar on his face turning a shade whiter. "Mister, Lawton respects boundaries. Talcott? Same as any man, but he also believes water belongs to the valley, not just the man who fences the creek. The law says otherwise," Henry said, stepping closer to the wire. "And a man who owns nothing but his saddle has no business lecturing a landowner on rights. You ride on?" "Mercer, before I decide you are trespassing with intent." Eli looked at Henry for a long moment. There was a dangerous stillness in the cowboy now, a coiled tension that reminded Clara of a rattlesnake before the strike. But he did not strike. He looked past Henry, his eyes finding Clara's one last time. "Ma'am," he nodded. "Tend to that hand." He swung back into the saddle, turned his horse, and rode away at a walk, refusing to give Henry the satisfaction of seeing him run. Henry watched him go, his chest heaving. He turned to Clara, and for a moment, she thought he might strike her, but he just pointed a shaking finger at the house. "Go inside," he said. "Bandage that hand. And do not let me catch you engaging with that trash again. They are like coyotes. Clara, you show them a weakness, and they circle." Clara walked back to the wagon, her hand throbbing, clutching the white cloth Eli had given her. It smelled of sage and river water. Dinner that night was a silent trial. The kitchen was hot, the wood stove holding the day's heat long after the sun had gone down. Clara set a plate of beans and cornbread in front of Henry. Her hand was bandaged, not with Eli's cloth, which she had hidden in the bottom of her sewing basket, but with a strip of old sheet. Henry ate methodically, his anger having cooled into a sullen resentment. "I saw the way he looked at you," Henry said suddenly. "Not looking up from his plate?" Clara froze, the water pitcher in her hand. "He was just being polite. Henry, I was hurt. He is a drifter," Henry said, cutting a piece of cornbread with unnecessary force. "They do not know polite. They know want. They see something that belongs to another man. A cow, a piece of land, a woman, and they want it because they are too weak to build it for themselves." "He is just a hand working for wages," Clara said, feeling a sudden, dangerous spark of defiance. "He has a job. For now," Henry countered, "until the snow flies or the whiskey runs out. Then he moves on. That is the problem with this country. Clara, it is full of men who leave. I stayed. I built this. I put down roots when everyone else was running for the goldfields or the coast." He looked up at her then, and she saw the fear behind his eyes. It was a terrified, desperate need to believe that his suffering had meaning. "We have to be hard. Clara," he said, his voice dropping. "The world is trying to take this from us. The fence is the only way to keep it whole." Clara looked at him, realizing with a sinking heart that he was not talking about the ranch. He was talking about himself. He was talking about them. He was fencing out the world because he was terrified that if he didn't, she might see what was on the other side and realize how small her life had become. "I am tired, Henry," she said quietly. "I am going to bed." He did not stop her. As July turned to August, the summer showed its teeth. The heat became a physical weight, pressing down on the valley until the air shimmered and danced. The creek that ran through the lower pasture began to recede, leaving behind cracked mud and the smell of rotting algae. The work did not stop. If anything, it intensified. Henry was in a race against the season, driven by a manic energy to finish the enclosure. Clara rode with him, her skin browning under the sun, her hands calloused and rough. She saw the cruelty of the land in sharp relief. She saw a calf that had wandered too far from its mother die of thirst in a dry wash, its tongue swollen and black. She saw dust storms that rose up like walls of bruised purple clouds, swallowing the sun and turning noon into a choking twilight. During those storms, they would huddle in the cabin, listening to the wind scour the logs, the grit seeping through the cracks in the door frame to coat their teeth and food. Clara felt stripped down. The niceties of her old life, the books, the soft fabrics, the polite conversations seemed like dreams from another existence. She was becoming a creature of survival, just like Henry. But where Henry hardened, Clara felt herself cracking open. The exhaustion left her raw, her emotions close to the surface. She found herself staring at the mountains for long stretches, wondering what it would feel like to be snow. One evening, a violent thunderstorm rolled through the valley. It brought no rain, only wind and lightning that jagged across the sky in terrifying arcs. The thunder shook the cabin, rattling the plates on the shelf. When it passed, the air was left cool and charged with ozone. Henry had fallen asleep in his chair, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the floor beside him. He had been drinking more lately, to soothe the pain in his knee and the worry in his mind. Clara could not sleep. The cabin felt too small, too full of Henry's heavy, snoring presence. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and slipped out the door. The moon was rising, painting the valley in silver and shadow. The fence line stood stark against the light, a silver thread running into the darkness. She walked along it, checking the posts. The wind had been fierce. She needed to see if it had brought any trees down on the wire. It was an excuse, and she knew it. She just wanted to walk. She was half a mile from the house when she saw him. A large cottonwood branch had snapped and fallen across the top wire, pressing it down dangerously close to the second strand. Eli Mercer was there, dismounted, struggling to heave the heavy branch off the line. Clara stopped, her breath catching. He was on his side of the fence, but his arms were reaching over, grappling with the wood. "Eli?" she called out softly, the wind carrying her voice. He startled, his hand going to his hip instinctively before he recognized her. He relaxed, exhaling a breath that puffed white in the cooling air. "Mrs. Talcott," he said. His voice was low, intimate in the vast silence. "What are you doing?" she asked, walking closer, checking the line. He said, "I figured this wind might have done some damage. Found this branch leaning on your wire. Thought I would clear it before it snapped the strand." "Henry would say you broke it," she said, standing just a few feet from him now, the wire between them. "I know what Henry would say," Eli replied. He grunted, heaving the branch up and tossing it back into the brush on his side. The wire sprang back into place, humming vibratingly. He turned to face her, leaning one shoulder against a fence post. He took off his hat and ran a hand through his hair. It was dark and thick, matted with sweat from his hat brim. "You are out late," he said. "I could not sleep," she admitted. "The house is quiet." "Too quiet?" he asked. Clara looked down at her boots. "Sometimes silence is loud. Mr. Mercer, call me Eli," he said. "Please, Eli." She tested the name. It felt round and solid in her mouth. He looked at her, his face illuminated by the moonlight. "You look tired." "Clara, it has been a hard summer," she said. "The heat, the work. It is a hard country," Eli said. "It takes a payment for letting you live here. Usually in sweat, sometimes in blood." "Is that what you have paid?" she asked, looking at the scar on his jaw. He touched the jagged line absently. "This? No. This was a payment for being young and stupid in a saloon in Abilene. But I have paid the land, too." He paused, looking out over the valley. "I had a wife once," he said softly, "and a little girl, up in Montana territory, 5 years back." Clara felt a shock go through her. "You were married?" Eli nodded. "For 3 years. We tried to homestead on the Milk River. It was a good spot, but the winter of '74, it was a killer. The fever came through, took the little one first, then Sarah. The ground was so frozen I could not dig the graves deep enough. I had to pile rocks over them to keep the wolves off." His voice was steady, devoid of self-pity, which broke Clara's heart more than tears would have. "I left after that," Eli said. "Burned the cabin. Just got on my horse and rode south. I have not stopped riding since. People look at me and see a drifter. They see a man with no roots. They do not know that my roots are buried under 6 feet of snow in Montana." Clara reached out, gripping the cedar post between them. "I am so sorry, Eli." He shrugged, a small, painful motion. "It is just the way of things. A man loses his center, he tends to wobble." "I know about losing your center," Clara whispered. Eli looked at her. "Do you? Henry seems solid. Henry is a rock." Clara said, "But rocks are hard. They do not bend." She looked at the moon, the words bubbling up from a place she had kept sealed for 2 years. "My father was a school teacher. He loved books and poker. He was not good at either. He racked up a debt to a man in St. Louis, $2,000. He didn't have it." She paused, her throat tight. "Henry paid it. He was passing through, looking for a wife to bring west. He saw me at the church social. He went to my father and offered to clear the debt in exchange for me." Eli went still. "He bought you?" "He would not call it that," Clara said bitterly. "He calls it providing. He says he saved me from ruin. My father cried when he told me. He said it was a good match. He said Henry was a man of substance. So I packed my trunk and I came west. I did what a daughter is supposed to do." She looked at Eli, tears stinging her eyes. "I am not a wife, Eli. I am a receipt. I am the proof that a debt was paid." Eli reached out then. He did not cross the fence, but he laid his hand over hers where it gripped the post. His hand was warm, rough, and trembling slightly. "You are more than that." "Clara," he said fiercely, "you are the only thing in this valley that has any color left in it." When I see you out here, hauling water or riding that wagon, I do not see a receipt. I see a woman who is carrying the sky on her shoulders and not breaking." Clara turned her hand over, interlacing her fingers with his. The wood of the post was between their palms, but the connection was electric. She felt a rush of life, a sudden, terrifying expansion of her world. "I feel like I am disappearing," she whispered. "I see you," Eli said. "I see you, Clara." They stood there for a long time, the wind sighing through the barbs, their hands clasped over the rough cedar. For the first time in years, Clara did not feel the crushing weight of the silence. She felt the beat of another human heart. "Clara!" The shout came from the direction of the house. It was distant, muffled by the wind, but unmistakable. Henry was awake. Clara jerked her hand back as if burned. She stepped away from the fence, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "He is calling," she said, panic rising in her voice. "Go," Eli said. He stepped back into the shadows of the sagebrush. "Go before he sees the lantern." Clara looked at him one last time. His face was a mask of regret and longing. "Be careful." "Eli," she whispered. She turned and ran back along the fence line, her skirts kicking up dust. The sky to the west was streaked with the last bruised purples of the storm and the rising silver of the moon. The fence ran beside her, a silver barrier that stretched forever. She felt safer as she neared the house, knowing Henry was there with his rifle and his certainty. But she also felt the trap snapping shut. Her heart was pounding, her blood singing in her veins. Eli's story of the snow and the rocks and the warmth of his hand on hers had unlocked something dangerous. She was alive, and God help her, she wanted to stay that way. Clara slowed to a walk as she reached the porch, composing her face, hiding her trembling hands in the folds of her shawl. She opened the door and stepped into the stifling heat of the cabin, leaving the wind and the cowboy on the other side of the wire. August burned itself out and left the valley covered in a gray shroud of ash and dust. The drought had ceased to be a season and had become a condition of existence, a punishing reality that stripped the flesh from the land. The creek, which had run clear and cold in June, was now a series of stagnant, muddy pools connected by a cracked bed of sun-baked clay. The willows along the banks had turned a brittle yellow, their leaves rattling like dry bones in the hot wind that never seemed to stop. On the Talcott Ranch, the strain was visible in the rib cages of the cattle. The herd moved lethargically, heads low, tongues lolling as they searched the parched range for tufts of brown grass. Every day, Henry Talcott rode out to check the stock, and every evening he returned with a face that looked as if it had been chiseled from granite. He sat at the dinner table, his ledger open, muttering about the falling price of beef in Chicago and the predatory interest rates at the bank in town. "It is Gable," Henry said one evening, stabbing his fork into a piece of tough salt pork. "That banker smiles when he shakes your hand, but he is counting the days until you fail. He wants the land. Clara, they all want the land. It is just a dry year." "Henry," Clara said, trying to keep her voice level, "the rains will come in the autumn." "And if they do not," Henry snapped, "do you think the Lawtons care if our cattle starve?" "No. They are likely cutting fences upstream, diverting the water. I saw their herd yesterday. They look fat. Fat, Clara, while ours are dropping." He poured himself another glass of whiskey. The bottle had become a fixture on the table, a brown glass sentinel that watched their silent meals. The fence was finished 3 days later. It stood as a monument to Henry's obsession. 5 miles of cedar posts and 3 strands of glinting, vicious wire stretching across the valley floor. It was a masterpiece of exclusion. The posts were set deep, the wire strung so tight that if you struck it, it hummed with a low, malevolent vibration. Under the high noon sun, the fence line looked like a silver knife slash across the belly of the world, severing the Talcott land from the open range beyond. Clara walked the length of it the day it was done. She touched a barb, sharp enough to draw blood with the slightest pressure. It was meant to keep the cattle in, Henry said, but standing there, looking through the wires at the purple sage on the other side. Clara felt the steel closing around her own throat. The fence did not just divide the land, it divided her life. On one side lay duty, silence, and the suffocating weight of Henry's fear. On the other lay the unknown, the wind, and a man with a scar on his face who had looked at her as if she were a woman and not a possession. The nights were the hardest. The heat lingered long after the sun went down, trapping the cabin in a suffocating embrace. Henry slept heavily now, his snoring thick and wet with whiskey, a sound that grated on Clara's nerves until she felt she might scream. One Tuesday night, when the moon was a thin paring in the sky, Clara slipped out of bed. She pulled her shawl over her nightdress and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cooler, smelling of sage and dry dust. She did not intend to walk far, but her feet seemed to know a path her mind had not agreed to. She walked to the fence. It was a quarter of a mile from the house, a dark line in the moonlight. She reached it and leaned against a cedar post, the rough bark digging into her shoulder. She looked out at the open range. It was a sea of shadows. Somewhere out there, coyotes were singing, a high, yipping chorus that sounded lonely and wild. She closed her eyes, letting the silence wash over her. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Clara gasped, her hand flying to her throat. She spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. A horse was standing on the other side of the wire, merging so perfectly with the darkness that she had not seen it. Eli Mercer was dismounting, his movements slow and deliberate so as not to spook her further. I did not hear you," Clara stammered. "I stay quiet when I can," Eli said. He walked to the fence, stopping a few feet away. He took off his hat, holding it in both hands. "I saw a lantern moving near the house. Then I saw a figure walking. I thought it might be rustlers scouting the line. I wanted to be sure you were safe." "I am safe," Clara said, though her pulse suggested otherwise. I could not sleep. The house is too hot. It is a stifling night." Eli agreed. He did not leave. He stood there, the wire between them, looking at her with that calm, steady gaze that made her feel unraveled. "Does he know you are out here?" Eli asked gently. "He is asleep," Clara said. "He sleeps soundly these days." Eli nodded, understanding the code. Whiskey sleep. They stood in silence for a long moment. The wind picked up, sighing through the barbs of the fence. It made a faint, humming sound, like a bow drawn across a broken fiddle string. "The fence is finished," Eli said, looking down the long, silver line. "Yes," Clara said. "Henry is proud of it." "It is a strong fence," Eli said. "It will hold." Clara looked at him. "Will it?" Eli met her eyes. "Fences only hold what wants to be held, Clara." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Clara felt a flush rise in her cheeks. She should go back. She should turn around and run to the safety of the cabin, but she did not move. "It looks like rain in the west," she said, grasping for safe ground. "Maybe," Eli said. "The air feels heavy. The cattle are bunching up in the draws. They know before we do. Do you think it will save the grass?" "It might be too late for the grass," Eli said, "but it might save the creek." They talked for 20 minutes. They talked about the weather, the price of flour, the way the hawks were circling the lower pasture. Small things, safe things. But beneath the banal words, there was a current of desperate intimacy. Every time he spoke, his voice low and rough, Clara felt a physical pull toward him. She wanted to reach through the wire. She wanted to touch the dust on his sleeve. She wanted to know if the scar on his jaw was smooth or rough. "I should go," she said finally. "Be safe." "Clara," Eli said. He waited until she was halfway back to the house before he mounted his horse. She turned and watched him ride away, a shadow dissolving into the night. It became a ritual. Every 2 or 3 nights, when Henry's breathing deepened into the heavy rhythm of stupor, Clara would walk to the fence, and Eli would be there. He never said he would be there. They made no appointments, but the pull between them was stronger than any signal. They stood on opposite sides of Henry's barrier, sharing the darkness. Eli told her about the places he had seen, the red rocks of Arizona, the great forests of the Oregon Territory, the ocean that looked like the sky fallen down to earth. Clara told him about the books she used to read, about the children she had taught in the schoolhouse back east, about the loneliness that tasted like dust in her mouth. They never touched. The fence was always there, a reminder and a guardian. But the space between them crackled with an energy that was becoming harder to contain. The town, however, had its own way of enforcing boundaries. On Sunday morning, the church in Cottonwood was stiflingly hot. The windows were open, but the air that drifted in was motionless. Clara sat beside Henry in their usual pew. Henry wore his Sunday suit, which hung loosely on his frame now. He had lost weight from the worry and the work. Reverend Thomas was preaching on the virtue of obedience, his voice booming about the sheep knowing the shepherd's voice. Clara stared at the back of Mrs. Gable's bonnet, trying to tune out the sermon. After the service, the congregation gathered on the porch. The women clustered in tight circles, fans fluttering like nervous moths. Clara stood by Henry as he talked to the blacksmith, but she drifted toward the edge of the porch, seeking a breath of fresh air. She heard Mrs. Miller's voice, sharp and carrying. Seen him at the saloon 3 nights in a row. That Mercer fellow, Mrs. Gable sniffed. Bad blood. That is what it is. My husband says his father was a horse thief in Kansas, hanged for it. The apple does not fall far from the tree. He has that look. Mrs. Miller agreed. Wild. A man like that does not belong anywhere. He's just waiting for a reason to turn violent. I tell you, no decent woman should so much as look his way. It invites trouble. One of the younger women giggled nervously. He is handsome, though in a rough way. Handsome is as handsome does. Mrs. Gable snapped. And that man does the devil's work. You mark my words. He will bring grief to this valley. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. She felt exposed, as if the women knew her secret, as if they could see the imprint of the moonlight on her skin. She looked around, terrified that someone was watching her reaction. Clara. Henry was at her elbow, his grip tight on her arm. The wagon is ready. She jumped, nearly crying out. Henry frowned, looking at her with a strange intensity. You are jumpy as a cat, he said. What is the matter with you? Nothing, Clara whispered. It is just the heat. Henry did not let go of her arm. He steered her toward the wagon, his fingers digging into her flesh through the sleeve of her dress. That week, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Henry's sullen silence was replaced by a sharp, probing suspicion. He watched her when she cooked. He watched her when she looked out the window. He was a man who sensed that he was losing control, and it made him dangerous. One night, Clara returned from the fence later than usual. She had lost track of time talking to Eli about the smell of the coming autumn. When she opened the door to the cabin, the lamp was lit. Henry was sitting in his chair, facing the door. He was not asleep. His eyes were red-rimmed and alert. Where have you been? He asked. His voice was soft, deadly. Clara froze, her hand on the latch. I went to check the chickens. I thought I heard a coyote. The chickens are on the north side. Henry said, you came from the east, from the fence. I walked the perimeter, Clara said, forcing her voice to remain steady. You know I cannot sleep. Henry stood up. He walked toward her, his boots heavy on the floorboards. He stopped inches from her, smelling of stale whiskey and old sweat. You spend a lot of time walking that fence. Clara, I am checking for breaks, she said. You said yourself it needs watching. At midnight? Henry asked. He reached out and grabbed her wrist. It was not a caress, it was a clamp. His fingers were like iron bands, squeezing until the bones ground together. Henry, you are hurting me, Clara said, trying to pull away. He pulled her closer, his face inches from hers. Is there something out there I should know about? Or someone? Clara's heart stopped. No, Henry, there is no one. Who would be out there? Henry stared at her, searching her eyes for a lie. Clara held his gaze, terrified that if she blinked, he would see the image of Eli burned into her retinas. Finally, Henry shoved her hand away. Do not lie to me, Clara, he warned. I will know. I always know. He turned and went to the bedroom, leaving her standing in the kitchen, rubbing her wrist. In the morning, there would be a bruise, 4 distinct fingerprints, purple and ugly against her pale skin. She would pull her sleeve down to hide it, but she would feel it burning there, a brand of ownership. The next evening at supper, the explosion nearly came. Henry had been in town that day. He came back in a foul mood, slamming the door so hard the plates rattled. "They cut the wire at the Miller place," he announced, throwing his hat on the table. Clara set a bowl of stew in front of him. "Who did? Rustlers? Drifters? Who knows?" Henry spooned stew into his mouth aggressively. "They cut 100 yards of fence. Let the cattle scatter. It is starting. Clara, the world is going soft. There is no respect for property anymore? No respect for a man's rights?" He looked up at her, his eyes drifting to the long sleeves of her dress. "A man has to protect what is his," Henry said. "With a gun if he has to. If I catch anyone on my land, anyone, I will shoot them. I will not ask questions. I will leave them for the buzzards." Clara felt a cold knot in her stomach. He was not just talking about cattle thieves. He was talking about Eli. "You cannot just shoot people." "Henry," she said softly, "that is murder. It is justice." Henry roared, slamming his fist on the table. The stew sloshed over the rim of the bowl. "It is the law of the West. Clara, if you do not hold the line, you lose everything, and I will not lose. Do you hear me? I will not lose. I hear you," Clara whispered. She cleared the table with trembling hands, aware for the first time that the violence in Henry was not just a possibility, it was a promise. 2 nights later, the storm that had been threatening finally broke. It was not the relief they had prayed for. It was a dry thunderstorm, violent and electric. The clouds boiled over the mountains, black as ink, and the lightning tore the sky apart. The wind howled, shaking the cabin walls. Henry was out at the barn, securing the doors. Clara saw her chance. She needed to warn Eli. She needed to tell him that Henry was watching, that he was talking about shooting. She threw her shawl over her head and ran out into the wind. The dust stung her face. She ran to the fence, the wire humming a frantic, high-pitched scream in the gale. Eli was there. He was standing by his horse, holding the reins tight as the animal danced nervously in the wind. He saw her coming and ran to the fence. "Clara!" he shouted over the wind. "You shouldn't be out here. It's dangerous." "Henry knows," she shouted back, gripping the wire, ignoring the barbs that bit into her palms. "He suspects something. He talked about shooting trespassers. You have to be careful. Eli, you have to stay away." Eli stepped closer, his face illuminated by a flash of lightning. He looked wild, his hair whipped by the wind, his eyes burning. "I cannot stay away," he said. "Not from you." Thunder cracked, deafeningly loud, directly overhead. The ground shook. "Clara," Eli said, his voice dropping, intense and desperate. "I cannot sleep. I cannot work. All I see is you in this prison." He reached out. His hand hovered over the top wire. The lightning flashed again, freezing the moment in blue-white light. His hand was inches from hers. She could see the lines in his palm, the dirt under his nails, the trembling of his fingers. She leaned forward. She wanted him to cross it. She wanted him to tear the fence down and take her with him. "Come across," she whispered. "Please." Eli's hand lowered. His fingertips brushed the back of her hand. It was a jolt stronger than the lightning. Then he pulled back. He gripped the post, his knuckles white. "No," he groaned. "No, Eli, if I cross this line." "Clara," he said, his voice ragged. "If I touch you, there is no going back. Everything changes. We burn it all down. Let it burn." Clara sobbed. "I do not care." "I do," Eli said, "because once I cross it, I will not leave you here. And if I take you, he will come for us, and I will have to kill him." Clara stared at him, the rain beginning to fall now. Huge, cold drops that splattered in the dust. She realized he was right. This was not a game. This was not a romance. It was life and death. He looked at her with a sorrow so deep it terrified her. "Go back to the house, Clara, before he finds you. But go!" Eli shouted, slapping the wire with his open hand. Clara turned and ran. She ran blindly through the sagebrush, the tears mixing with the rain on her face. She stumbled onto the porch just as Henry was coming back from the barn. He stopped, seeing her wet and breathless, her chest heaving. "Where were you?" he demanded, wiping rain from his face. "The shutters," Clara gasped, the lie coming from a place of pure survival. The wind blew the bedroom shutters open. "I was trying to latch them from the outside." Henry looked at her. He looked at her wet dress, her wild eyes. He did not believe her. She could see it in the set of his jaw, but he was too tired, and the storm was too loud to fight it out now. "Get inside," he grunted. Clara went into the bedroom. She sat on the edge of the bed, shaking uncontrollably. Her body was humming, every nerve ending alive and screaming. It was a mixture of terror and a desire so fierce it felt like a sickness. She looked at her hand, the spot where his fingers had brushed hers. She knew then that the fence was already broken. The wire still stood, but the barrier in her heart had snapped. She lay down in the dark, listening to the thunder, and for the first time, she did not pray for rain. She prayed for the courage to ruin herself, because she knew, with a terrifying clarity, that the next time Eli reached for her, she would pull him across. September brought a darkness to the Sweetwater Valley that had nothing to do with the shortening days. It came in the form of cut wire and missing stock, a silent plague that moved through the range under the cover of the new moon. A gang of rustlers had drifted down from the Wyoming territory, men who knew how to work in the rain and leave no tracks. They were ghosts, striking a ranch 10 miles east one night, then hitting a spread 20 miles west the next. They did not just open gates. They cut the fences, leaving the wire curled and snapping in the wind, a deliberate insult to the men who had broken their backs to string it. The mood in Cottonwood turned ugly. The talk in the saloon was no longer about rain or the price of beef, but about lead and rope. The ranchers, men who usually argued over water rights and property lines, found a common enemy. They formed loose posses, groups of grim-faced riders who patrolled the perimeter of the valley, their rifles scabbarded but loose, their eyes scanning the brush for any movement that did not belong. Henry Talcott became a man possessed. The fence was his line in the sand, and the idea of someone cutting it was a violation he took personally. He stopped sleeping in the bed. He slept in the chair by the door, his Winchester rifle leaning against the wall, a box of .44 caliber shells on the table beside the Bible. "I will not let them take what is mine," Henry said one evening, cleaning the rifle with an oiled rag. The smell of gun oil and stale coffee permeated the cabin. "They think because the law is slow, they can pick us clean. They will find that I am not slow. You cannot ride every night." "Henry," Clara said, watching him from the stove, "you are exhausted. You will make a mistake. A mistake is sleeping while thieves cut your livelihood." Henry snapped. He stood up, wincing as his bad knee took his weight. "Lock the door when I leave. Clara, do not open it for anyone. If you hear riding, you blow the lantern out and you get under the bed." He put on his coat, the heavy canvas stiff with dirt, and walked out into the night. Clara locked the door. She slid the heavy wooden bolt into place, the sound echoing in the empty room. Then she blew out the lamp. She stood in the darkness, listening to the hoofbeats of Henry's horse fade into the distance. And then, as the silence of the house settled around her, she felt it, a slow, shameful uncoiling in her chest. It was fear. Yes, she worried for Henry, out there in the blackness where men with guns waited. But beneath the fear was a profound, guilty relief. The house was hers. The air was hers. For a few hours, she did not have to shrink to fit the space Henry allowed her. She could walk to the window and look out without being asked what she was looking for. She could sit in the rocking chair and let her hands lie idle in her lap without being told there was mending to do. Outside, the wind began to pick up. It was the lead edge of a storm that had been bruising the western horizon all afternoon. The shutters rattled against the logs, a lonely, wooden sound. Clara pulled her shawl tighter, listening to the wind slam against the cabin, and imagined it was the sound of the world trying to get in, or perhaps the sound of her own spirit trying to get out. The violence arrived 3 nights later. The storm that hit was not a dry frustration like the summer gales. This was a deluge. The sky opened up and dropped a curtain of water so heavy it sounded like gravel hitting the roof. Thunder walked across the valley floor in earth-shaking stomps, rattling the tin cups on the shelf. Clara was awake, lying in the center of the large bed, listening to the fury outside. Henry had been gone since dusk. He had ridden toward the north ridge, convinced that was where the rustlers would strike next. Then she heard it. It was not thunder. It was a sharper sound, a pop, pop, pop that cracked through the roar of the rain. Gunshots. They were distant, muffled by the storm, but unmistakable. Clara sat up, her heart hammering against her ribs. She strained to listen. A low rumble began. At first, she thought it was the wind, but it grew deeper, a vibration that she could feel in the frame of the bed. It was the sound of the earth moving. Cattle. A stampede. The gunshots had spooked them. Hundreds of terrified animals were running blind in the dark. The rumble grew to a roar, and then came the sound of destruction. The fence. She heard the high-pitched ping of wire snapping under immense pressure, a sound that cut through the storm like a scream. Then the splintering of cedar posts. The herd was crashing through the line, directly south of the house. Clara did not think. She did not remember Henry's order to hide under the bed. She thought of the garden she had watered with buckets carried by hand. She thought of the milk cow tied in the lean-to. She thought of the house itself, a small wooden island in a river of panic. She grabbed Henry's heavy slicker from the hook by the door, threw it over her nightdress, and shoved her feet into her boots. She lit a lantern, though she knew the wind would likely kill it, and threw the door open. The noise was deafening. The world was a chaos of rain, mud, and the bellowing of cattle. Clara ran off the porch, shielding the lantern with her body. The light was a feeble, yellow sphere in the overwhelming blackness. She could see dark shapes streaming past the barn, eyes rolling white in the lantern light, horns tossing. The main body of the stampede had missed the house by 50 yards, breaking through the fence and pouring into the lower pasture, but strays were scattering everywhere. "Hey!" Clara screamed, waving the lantern, trying to turn a group of heifers away from the garden fence. "Hey!" Her voice was nothing against the storm. The wind tore the sound from her throat. Suddenly, a rider emerged from the deluge. He was a blur of motion, his horse fighting the mud, pushing a knot of cattle away from the barn. He was shouting, waving a coiled rope. "Turn! Hya! Turn!" It was not Henry. The rider moved with a reckless grace, leaning low over the horse's neck. More riders appeared, dark ghosts in the rain, shouting and whistling. The neighboring hands. They must have been chasing the rustlers or the herd. Clara ran toward the broken fence line, thinking she could wave the lantern to show them the gap, to help them turn the herd back. It was a foolish, desperate thought born of adrenaline. She reached the edge of the crushed wire. The mud was slick as grease. A flash of lightning turned the night into a blinding white photograph. In that flash, she saw a steer, separated from the herd, confused and terrified. It was 10 feet away, and it was charging. Clara froze. The animal lowered its head, blowing snot and rain. "Look out!" The shout came from above her. A horse slammed into the mud between her and the steer. The impact was heavy, meat on meat. The horse groaned, sliding on the treacherous ground, its shoulder checking the steer and knocking it sideways. The rider did not stay in the saddle. The angle was too sharp, the mud too deep. The horse went down to its knees, and the rider was thrown clear. He hit the ground and rolled, scrambling up instantly. He lunged for Clara, grabbing her around the waist just as the steer scrambled for footing and thrashed its head, its horns slicing the air where Clara had been standing a second before. The man's momentum carried them both backward. Clara felt the world spin. They hit the mud hard, tumbling over the broken fence posts and the tangled, snapping wire. They landed in a heap in the wet sagebrush on the wrong side of the fence. Clara gasped. The wind knocked out of her. She was lying in the mud, the rain pounding her face. A heavy weight was pressing her down. "Are you hurt?" The voice was a rough rasp. Right at her ear, she knew the voice. "Eli?" she choked out. Eli Mercer pushed himself up on his elbows. He was soaked, his hat gone, his hair plastered to his skull. His face was streaked with mud, but his eyes were wide and terrified. "Clara," he said, breathless. "God Almighty, you could have been killed." He grabbed her shoulders, shaking her slightly, checking her. "Are you hit? Did the horn catch you?" I do not think so," Clara stammered. She tried to sit up. Her arm burned. A sharp, stinging pain. "My arm." Eli looked down. In the flashes of lightning, the blood was dark against the wet white sleeve of her nightdress, which protruded from the slicker. The wire had caught her. "We cannot stay here," Eli shouted over the thunder. "The herd is scattering. They might turn back this way." He looked around desperately. "The line shack," he said. "It is just down the draw. Can you walk?" "Yes," Clara said. He pulled her to her feet. They were both covered in mud, shivering violently. Eli wrapped his arm around her waist, supporting her. They stumbled through the storm, away from the ranch house, away from the broken fence, and into the dark maw of the open range. The line shack was little more than a pile of rotting logs and a tin roof that rattled like a drum in the rain. It had been abandoned 10 years ago by a failed homesteader. There was no door, only a gaping black maw. Eli practically carried her inside. The air in the shack was cold and smelled of wet wood and rat nests, but it was out of the wind. He sat her down on a dusty wooden crate in the corner. "Stay here," he ordered. He went back to the doorway, peering out into the storm. He waited for a long minute, watching the dark shapes of the cattle moving in the distance. The thunder was moving east, but the rain was still a torrent. "They are moving off," he said, turning back to her. He slumped against the wall, sliding down until he was sitting on the dirt floor. He wiped the water from his eyes. That was close. Clara, that was too close. Clara was shaking. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold that seeped into her bones. Her teeth chattered. "Where? Where is Henry?" she asked. Eli shook his head. "I do not know. We heard the shots. The boys from the double barquet were riding the perimeter. We saw the herd break. We just rode to turn them. I did not know. I did not know you would be out in it." He crawled over to her on his hands and knees. "Let me see your arm." He had a box of matches in his shirt pocket, wrapped in oilcloth. He struck one. The small flame flared, illuminating the small, wretched space. The shadows danced on the log walls. Clara held out her arm. The heavy canvas of the slicker had protected her mostly, but the wire had torn through the fabric near the elbow. There was a gash, 3 inches long, bleeding sluggishly. Eli looked at it, his face grim. "It is not deep," he said, "but it needs cleaning." The match burned down to his fingers. He hissed and dropped it, plunging them back into darkness. "I have a flask," he said in the dark. "Whiskey. It will hurt." "Do it," Clara whispered. He uncorked the flask. She felt his hands finding her arm in the dark. His touch was gentle, incredibly precise for a man who worked with rope and branding irons. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes." He poured the whiskey over the cut. Clara sucked in a sharp breath, her body seizing up. The burn was white hot. "I'm sorry," Eli murmured. "I am sorry." He used his own neckerchief, soaking it in the remaining whiskey, and bound the wound. His hands lingered on her arm after the knot was tied. He did not pull away. They were huddled together in the corner of the shack, the only dry spot under the leaking roof. The storm raged outside, a wall of noise that separated them from the rest of the world. Clara could feel the heat radiating from him. She could smell the rain on his skin, the wet leather, the whiskey, and the scent of man and horse. She was shivering, but not just from the cold. "You saved me," she said softly. "I almost trampled you," Eli said, his voice ragged. "When I saw you standing there, holding that lantern like a damn lighthouse against a tidal wave, my heart stopped. Clara, it just stopped." He leaned his forehead against her knee. She could feel him trembling. "I thought I lost you," he whispered. "And I realized I would rather die in the mud than watch you get hurt." Clara reached out. Her hand found his wet hair. She stroked it, the gesture instinctual, ancient. "I was not trying to save the house," she confessed, her voice trembling. "When I heard the fence break, I ran out. I told myself it was for the garden, but it wasn't." She swallowed the lump in her throat. "I wanted to see it down. I wanted to see the wire snap. I hate it. Eli, I hate that fence. I hate this life. I feel like I am suffocating every time I take a breath. Henry, he is building a coffin, not a ranch, and he is putting me inside it." Eli lifted his head. In the gloom, she could just make out the shine of his eyes. "You are not made for coffins." "Clara," he said fiercely, "you are made for the sun. I have watched you. I have watched you for months. You are stronger than he is. You are stronger than this whole damn valley." "He is my husband," Clara said, the words tasting like ash. "He is a fool," Eli said. "A man who fences a woman like you. He does not know what he has. He only knows what he is afraid to lose." He moved closer. He was on his knees now, his face level with hers. The air between them was electric, charged with the ozone of the storm and months of silence. "I have tried." "Clara," Eli whispered, "I have tried to stay on my side. I have ridden 10 miles out of my way to keep from crossing that line. But tonight, when I saw you in the mud—" He stopped. His breath hitched. "I cannot do it anymore. I cannot pretend that I do not wake up every morning wondering if you are happy. I cannot pretend that I do not look for your light in the window every night." Clara felt the tears spilling over, hot tracks on her cold cheeks. "I look for you too," she admitted, her voice breaking. "Every night, I stand at the post and I pray you will come. I am so lonely. Eli, I am so lonely, I can feel it in my teeth." Eli reached out and cupped her face in his rough hands. His thumbs brushed away the tears. "You are not alone," he said. "Not tonight." He leaned in. The first touch of his lips was tentative, a question asked in the dark. Clara answered it with a sob, leaning into him, her hands grabbing the wet front of his shirt. The kiss broke them open. It was desperate, tasting of rain and whiskey and fear. It was the collision of two starving people finding a feast. The fence was gone. The laws of the valley, the vows spoken in a church, the judgment of the town. It all dissolved in the heat of the line shack. Clara pulled him closer, needing to feel the weight of him, the reality of him. She needed to know that she was still flesh and blood, not just a ghost in Henry's house. "Eli," she breathed against his mouth. "I am here." He swore, "I am here." They sank down onto the dirt floor, wrapped in the heavy slicker and each other's arms. The storm hammered the roof, trying to get in. But for the first time in years, Clara did not feel the wind. She only felt the fire. They crossed the boundary they had circled for so long, and in the darkness of the shack, with the smell of wet earth around them, they claimed something that belonged only to them. It was a sin. She knew, but as Eli held her, his touch reverent and desperate, it felt like the first honest thing she had done in her life. The dawn came gray and cold. The rain had stopped, leaving the world scoured and raw. Clara woke to the sound of water dripping from the eaves. She was lying with her head on Eli's chest, his coat thrown over them both. For a moment, she felt a profound peace. Then, memory rushed back, cold and sharp as a knife. She sat up, clutching the coat to her chest. The shack was small and dirty in the light. The reality of the morning hit her with the force of a blow. She had ruined herself. She had broken the covenant. Eli stirred and sat up. He did not look away. He looked at her with a naked vulnerability that made her heart ache. "Clara," he said quietly. She turned her face away, shame washing over her. "I have to go back. Henry, if he is back—" Eli reached out and took her hand. He did not let her pull away. "Look at me," he said. She turned to him. "I do not regret it," Eli said firmly. "I will not say I do. I love you. Clara." The words hung in the cold air. "But I know what this means," he continued. I know what the town will say. I know what Henry will do. He squeezed her hand. You say the word, and I will ride out. I will pack my roll and head for Mexico or Canada. You can go back to him. You can tell him I found you in the storm and left you here for safety. You can tell him nothing happened. I will never speak a word of it. Clara looked at him. She saw the offer for what it was. A sacrifice. He was willing to vanish to save her reputation. And if I do not want you to go? She whispered. Eli's eyes searched hers. Then you tell me what to do, and I will do it, against Henry, against the town, against the devil himself. I am yours. Clara. Clara stood up, her legs trembling. She arranged her dress, smoothing the mud-stained fabric. She put on the heavy slicker, hiding the woman she had become during the night. I have to go home, she said. I have to see. I have to know if he is alive. I will walk you to the fence. Eli said. They walked in silence across the sodden prairie. The mud sucked at their boots. The air was thick with mist. When they reached the ranch, the devastation was clear. The fence was a tangle of wire and broken wood for 100 yards. The cattle were gone, scattered into the hills, but the house stood. Clara stopped at the edge of the yard. I go alone from here, she said. Eli nodded. He stood by the broken fence post, a sentinel in the mist. I will be watching, he promised. Clara walked to the porch. Her boots felt heavy as lead. She opened the door. The cabin was cold. The fire had gone out. Henry? She called softly. A groan answered her from the bedroom. Clara rushed in. Henry was lying on the bed, still in his wet clothes. His face was pale, gray as the ash in the stove. His leg, the good one, was twisted at an odd angle. Henry! Clara gasped, rushing to his side. He opened his eyes. They were glassy with pain. The horse slipped. He rasped. Canyon rim, went down hard, crawled back 2 miles. He looked at her, his eyes focusing with difficulty. Where were you? I called for you. Clara froze. The lie sat on her tongue, heavy and bitter. The cattle broke the fence. She said, I tried to stop them. I got lost in the storm. I took shelter in the old line shack. Henry stared at her. He looked at her mud-stained face, her bandaged arm. He reached out a shaking hand and touched the sleeve of the slicker. You are safe? He asked. I am safe, Clara said. Henry closed his eyes, his head falling back against the pillow. Good. That is good. We lost the herd. Clara, but you are safe. Clara looked down at her husband. He was broken, in pain, and relieved that she was alive, and she had just come from the arms of another man. The guilt hit her then, not as a sharp pain, but as a crushing weight. She began to unbutton his wet shirt, her fingers trembling. I will get the doctor, she said. I will get help. She worked mechanically, tending to him, wiping the mud from his face. But every time she touched him, she felt the ghost of Eli's hands on her skin. She glanced out the window. Through the gray mist, past the barn, she could see the broken fence line. And beyond it, barely visible, a lone rider sat on a horse, watching the house. Clara turned back to her husband, her heart divided, knowing that the storm outside had passed. But the storm inside her had only just begun. The storm had passed, but it left a stain on the Sweetwater Valley that the sun could not bleach out. The rain that had hammered the earth for a single, violent night had washed away the tracks of the rustlers, but it had not washed away the dead. 2 days after the stampede, a rider from the Double Bar K found the body of a young ranch hand named Caleb Wright. He was a boy of 19 who had come west from Ohio with dreams of cowboys and open skies. They found him tangled in a mess of cut wire near the dry wash 3 miles east of the Talcott place. He had not been dragged by a horse. He had been beaten. His face was a ruin of purple bruising, and his hands were tied behind his back with a length of rawhide. It was a message. It was a brutality that turned the stomach of every man who looked upon it. The rustlers were not just thieves anymore. They were killers. The mood in the valley shifted instantly from frustration to a cold, hard rage. Men who had spent the summer arguing over water rights now gathered in tight knots outside the saloon in Cottonwood. their voices low and their eyes hard. They spoke of justice. They spoke of ropes. They spoke of the law being too slow, a turtle trying to catch a hare, and how a man had a right, a duty, to protect his own. On the Talcott Ranch, the air was thick with a tension that felt like the precursor to an explosion. Henry Talcott was a wounded animal, and like any wounded animal, he was dangerous. His horse had crushed his leg in the fall during the storm, fracturing the bone below the knee. The doctor from town had set it, binding it tight with splints and bandages. But Henry refused to stay in bed. He hobbled around the ranch house on a crutch whittled from ash wood, his face gray with pain, his eyes burning with a feverish intensity. He sat at the kitchen table, his leg propped up on a stool, cleaning his Winchester rifle. The smell of gun oil was sharp and metallic, overpowering the scent of the bacon Clara was frying. "They killed that boy," Henry said, his voice a low growl. "Just a boy, and they left him there like trash." He worked the lever of the rifle, the mechanism clicking smoothly. Click-clack. Clara kept her back to him, stirring the pan. Her hands were trembling, and she had to grip the wooden spoon tight to stop them. Since the night in the line shack, she had been living in a state of suspended terror. Every time Henry looked at her, she felt certain he could see the imprint of Eli's hands on her skin. "It is a tragedy, Henry," she said quietly. "It is war," Henry corrected. "That is what it is, and we are losing because we are soft." He set the rifle down and picked up a rag, rubbing the stock. "I spoke to Miller yesterday. He says he saw tracks near the North Ridge. Shod horses, not Indian ponies. These are men who know the land, men who know the schedules of the ranches." He looked at Clara's back. "It makes you think, does it not?" "Think what?" Clara asked. "Not turning around, that maybe they have help," Henry said. "Maybe they have someone on the inside, a drifter who works a season here, a season there, someone who learns the lay of the land, sees where the fences are weak, and then sells that information for a bottle of whiskey." Clara felt a cold stone settle in her stomach. "Who do you mean? You know who I mean," Henry snapped. "That Mercer fellow, the one who was so helpful to you when your wagon was stuck. Eli Mercer works for Mr. Lawton," Clara said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "He has been at the Double Bar K all season." "And where was he before that?" Henry challenged. "Texas? Kansas? He has no people." "Clara, he has no name to protect. A man like that changes his loyalty as easily as he changes his shirt." "He helped save our cattle during the storm," Clara said, the defense slipping out before she could stop it. "Did he?" Henry asked, his voice dropping to a suspicious whisper. "Or did he just make it look that way? Maybe he was guiding them out, not turning them back. It is easy to look like a hero when you are the one setting the fire." Clara turned then, facing him. "You cannot accuse a man of murder without proof." "Henry, I do not need a court of law to know a coyote when I see one," Henry said. "And when I find the proof, Clara, God help him. Because the sheriff will be the last one to know." He stared at her, his eyes drilling into hers, searching for something. Clara held his gaze for a second, then turned back to the stove, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Later that day, Clara had to go into town. The flour barrel was empty, and Henry needed laudanum for the pain in his leg, though he refused to admit it. Cottonwood felt different. The dust in the street seemed to carry a charge. Men stood on the boardwalks with rifles leaning against the wall next to them. The usual chatter of the town was subdued, replaced by suspicious glances at anyone who rode in from the range. Clara walked into the mercantile. The bell above the door jingled, a cheerful sound that felt obscene in the grim atmosphere. Mrs. Gable was at the counter, talking to Mrs. Miller. They stopped abruptly when Clara entered, then offered tight, thin smiles. "Clara, Mrs." Gable said, "How is Henry? We heard about his accident." "He is mending," Clara said, moving to the dry goods shelf. "He is in pain, but he is strong. He is a brave man," Mrs. Miller said, "riding out in that storm. It is a mercy he was not killed like that poor Wright boy." Clara felt a shiver crawl up her spine. "Yes," she whispered, A mercy. Have you heard the talk, Mrs.? Gable lowered her voice, leaning over the counter. The sheriff is questioning people. They say he is looking hard at the seasonal hands. I heard, Clara said, picking up a sack of flour. My husband says that Mercer man is nowhere to be found today. Mrs. Gable continued, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the gossip. He did not report for work at the Lawton place this morning. They say he was seen riding near the canyon where the rustlers cut the wire. Clara's hand slipped. The sack of flour hit the counter with a heavy thud, puffing a small white cloud into the air. Mrs. Miller's eyes narrowed. You seem upset. Clara, I am just tired, Clara stammered. The storm. The ranch. It has been too much. She fumbled in her reticule for coins. Her fingers were numb. She dropped a quarter, and it rolled across the wooden floor, spinning to a stop near Mrs. Gable's boot. Clara bent to pick it up, her face burning. When she straightened, she found Mrs. Gable watching her. It was not a look of sympathy. It was the look of a hawk spotting a mouse in the grass. It was a look that said, I see you shaking. I see your fear. And I wonder why a married woman trembles at the mention of a drifter's name. There is nothing to worry about. Clara, Mrs. Gable said slowly. Unless, of course, one has reason to worry. Clara placed the money on the counter. Not waiting for her change. I have to get back. Henry is waiting. She walked out of the store, feeling Mrs. Gable's gaze boring into her back like an auger. She hurried to the wagon, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The net was tightening. It was made of whispers and suspicion, and it was closing around Eli's throat. That evening, the ranch house was a cauldron of suppressed violence. Henry's pain had worsened as the day wore on. He had been drinking whiskey since noon, and his temper was fraying. He sat in the chair, his leg throbbing, watching Clara set the table. You were gone a long time, he said. I had to wait at the apothecary. Clara lied. The clerk was busy, Henry grunted. He picked up his fork and stabbed a potato. I saw tracks today. Clara froze. Where? Down by the creek, where the fence was broken. That is where the stampede went through. Henry, there are tracks everywhere. Not these tracks, Henry said. He looked up at her, his eyes bloodshot and glassy. These were fresh. 2 horses. They were riding close together. One of them had a split hoof on the near hind. I know that track. That is your mare. Clara. Clara felt the room spin. I rode down there yesterday to check the repair, she said. And the other horse? Henry asked softly. Who was riding with you, Clara? No one, she said, her voice sounding thin and brittle in her own ears. I was alone. Henry slammed his hand on the table. The plates jumped. Do not lie to me, he roared. He reached out and grabbed her wrist, pulling her toward him. He was crippled, but his grip was still terrifyingly strong. I saw the prince, Henry shouted, his face twisting with rage and pain. A man's horse, a heavy horse. They stood there for a long time, right where the wire was cut. Were you meeting him? Were you meeting the man who is stealing my cattle? Clara's tears spilled over. No, Henry, you are crazy. I was alone. He pulled her closer until his face was inches from hers. She could smell the sour whiskey on his breath. I will find out. Clara, he hissed. If you are protecting him, if you are helping him, I will kill him. Do you understand? I will hang him from the gatepost. He shoved her away. She stumbled back against the stove, clutching her wrist. Clear the table, Henry ordered, turning his face away. I cannot look at you. Clara cleared the dishes, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped the plates. She knew then that time had run out. Henry was not just suspicious. He was convinced. He was constructing a narrative where Eli was the villain and she was the dupe. Or worse, the accomplice. And in Henry's world, villains did not get trials. They got bullets. She had to warn him. She waited until midnight. Henry had finally fallen into a stupor, the whiskey and the laudanum dragging him down into a heavy, snoring sleep. Clara dressed in the dark, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. She slipped out the back door, moving like a ghost across the porch. The night was cold. The moon was obscured by clouds, leaving the valley in deep shadow. Clara did not take a horse. The sound of hooves would wake Henry. She walked. She ran. She ran toward the fence line, toward the place where the cottonwood tree stood, the place where they had first touched hands. "Please be there," she prayed. "Please, God, let him be there." She reached the fence, her chest heaving, her lungs burning. The wire hummed in the wind. "Eli," she whispered into the darkness. "Eli." For a terrifying moment, there was only silence. Then a shadow detached itself from the brush on the other side. "Clara, it was him. He was there." He hurried to the fence. He looked tired, his face drawn, the scar on his jaw standing out white against the darkness of his skin. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and urgent. "It is not safe. They know." "Eli!" Clara gasped, gripping the wire post. "They are saying it was you, the rustling, the dead boy." Eli closed his eyes for a moment, letting out a heavy breath. "I heard. I was in town this morning." "The sheriff asked me questions for an hour. Henry believes it." Clara said, "He found tracks. He thinks I am helping you steal the cattle. He thinks we are in it together." Eli's hands tightened on the wire. "He thinks you are a thief. He thinks I am a traitor." Clara said, "Eli, you have to leave. You have to go tonight." "I am not running," Eli said stubbornly. "I did not kill that boy. Clara, I did not cut your wire. It does not matter," Clara cried, reaching through the fence to grab his shirt. "The truth does not matter. They want someone to hang. They hate you because you are a stranger. They hate you because you are free. Henry talks about making an example. He will kill you. Eli, please, go." Eli reached through the wire and covered her hands with his. His touch was warm, solid. "And leave you with him?" he asked. "Leave you to be accused, to be punished for something you did not do? I can handle Henry." Clara lied. "You cannot," Eli said. "I see the bruises. Clara, I see the way you look when you talk about him. If I leave you in a prison. It is better than seeing you dead," she sobbed. He looked at her, his eyes intense in the gloom. Is it? Is it better to survive if you are dead inside? Clara, listen to me. I have run my whole life. I ran from the war. I ran from the snow in Montana. I ran from the memories of my wife. I am done running. I love you, and I will not leave this valley unless you are riding beside me. Clara pressed her forehead against the rough wood of the post. "You are a fool, Eli Mercer." "Maybe," he said softly, "but I am an innocent fool. I have a past." "Clara," he admitted, his voice dropping, "I rode with a bad crowd in Kansas. Years ago, the Quantrill boys. I was young, and I was angry. I held horses while they did things I cannot wash off. That is why they will believe I did this, because I have the stain on me." He squeezed her hands. "But I never killed a man in cold blood. And I never stole from a man who was working the land. I changed. Clara, you have to believe that. I believe you," she whispered. "I believe you with everything I am." "Then that is enough," Eli said. He leaned forward, pressing his face toward the gap in the wire. Clara leaned in, meeting him. They kissed through the fence, a desperate, terrified collision of mouths. It tasted of salt and fear. It was a goodbye and a vow all at once. "Go back to the house," Eli said, pulling away reluctantly. "If Henry wakes up, I will try to make him listen," Clara said. "I will try to make him see reason. Be careful." "Clara." She turned and ran back into the darkness, leaving him standing at the line. But they were not alone. 50 yards away, hidden in a cluster of sagebrush on the ridge, Henry Talcott lowered his field glasses. He had not taken the laudanum. He had not been asleep. He had feigned the stupor, waiting for the moment he knew would come. When Clara had left the house, he had followed her, ignoring the screaming agony in his broken leg, dragging himself through the brush with the silence of a hunter. He had seen it all. He had not heard the words. The wind was too strong. But he had seen the way they stood. He had seen the way Clara gripped his shirt. He had seen the kiss. It was not a conspirators' meeting. It was a lover's tryst. Henry sat in the dirt, his leg throbbing with a pulse that matched the pounding in his temples. The rage that filled him was cold and absolute. It was worse than theft. It was worse than murder. It was a theft of his manhood. A drifter, a man with nothing, had taken the one thing Henry owned completely. He did not yell. He did not fire his rifle, though he had it with him. To shoot now would be too quick. It would be a crime of passion. Henry wanted something more permanent. He wanted erasure. He watched Eli mount his horse and ride away. He watched Clara disappear toward the house. Henry checked the load in his rifle. Then he began the long, painful crawl back to the ranch. He had a plan. He would not just kill the body. He would kill the name. He would turn the town's fear into a weapon, and he would use it to crush Eli Mercer into the dust until there was nothing left but a memory of a warning. The next morning, a notice appeared on the door of the town hall in Cottonwood. It was written in a heavy, angry hand. Meeting. Concerning the rustler threat and suspicious persons in our midst. Tonight, 7 o'clock, at the livery. Justice will be served. Clara saw it when she went to fetch the mail. She stood before the paper, the letters blurring before her eyes. She knew Henry's handwriting. She knew the sharp, jagged strokes of his pen. She looked around the street. Men were reading it, nodding, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "It is about time," one man muttered. "High time," another agreed. Clara felt the ground sway beneath her. It was not a meeting. It was a summons to a lynching. Henry was not going to shoot Eli himself. He was going to hand him to the mob. He was going to let the town's prejudice do his work for him, washing his hands in the blood of a rustler, while keeping his own shame buried. She walked back to her wagon, her legs moving like wooden stilts. She climbed onto the seat and looked toward the distant hills where the double-bark hay lay. She had to make a choice. She could stay silent, protect her name, protect her marriage, and watch the man she loved swing from a rope. Or she could speak and burn her life to the ground. She snapped the reins, the horses lurching forward. The fence line ran alongside the road, a constant, glinting companion. It had been built to keep things out. But now, Clara realized, the only way to be free was to tear it down, post by post, no matter the cost. The sun refused to set with any grace that evening. It hung low in the western sky, a swollen, blood-red eye that glared down at the town of Cottonwood, baking the dust until the air shimmered with heat and malice. It was 7 o'clock, but the temperature had not broken. The wind had died, leaving a stifling stillness that amplified the sound of boots scraping on dry earth and the nervous stamping of horses. The gathering at the livery stable was not a town meeting. It was a tribunal held in the open air, fueled by whiskey, fear, and a summer of bad luck that demanded a sacrificial offering. The large double doors of the stable were thrown open, revealing the dark, hay-scented interior. But the men gathered outside in the dirt street, forming a loose, restless circle. Clara stood at the edge of the crowd near the water trough. She had tied her bonnet strings tight to hide the trembling of her jaw. She felt invisible, a ghost haunting the edges of a tragedy she had helped write. She saw Henry near the front. He was leaning heavily on his ash-wood crutch, his bad leg held stiffly out, his face pale and beaded with sweat. But his eyes were clear. They were burning with a cold, terrifying purpose. A shout went up from the north road. "They are bringing him in!" The crowd shifted, a single organism turning its head. 2 riders approached, flanking a third man on a horse that looked ridden into the ground. It was Miller and his foreman, heavy men with rifles balanced across their saddle horns. Between them rode Eli Mercer. They had not tied him to the saddle, but the threat of the rifles was clear. Eli sat tall, his posture easy, though his face was drawn and weary. He wore his dust, his poverty, and his scar like a challenge. When he dismounted, he did not stumble. He stepped down into the dust, dusted off his trousers, and looked at the faces surrounding him. Miller spoke first, his voice booming for the crowd. "Found him near the canyon," Miller announced, spitting tobacco juice onto the ground, right where the wire was cut last night. Claimed he was just passing through on a horse that looked like it had been run halfway to Mexico. I was heading to the high range, Eli said, his voice calm, cutting through the murmurs, checking for strays, same as any of you would do. Checking for strays or checking for an escape route? Someone shouted from the back. Laughter followed, but it was not mirthful. It was the sharp, barking laughter of men who were afraid and wanted to hurt something to make the fear go away. Sheriff Brady stepped forward. He was a man who had been elected for his affability, not his spine, and he looked ill. He wiped his forehead with a stained handkerchief. "All right, settle down," he said, his voice lacking authority. "Mr. Mercer, you have some explaining to do. There's a lot of loose stock in a dead boy, and folks are saying your name comes up too often." "I have answered your questions." "Sheriff," Eli said, "I have nothing to hide. Then you will not mind if we secure you while we talk," the sheriff said, glancing nervously at the mood of the crowd. "Just for everyone's peace of mind." He pulled a length of hemp rope from his belt. Eli hesitated, his eyes scanning the circle. He looked for Clara. When he found her, standing in the shadow of the mercantile awning, his expression did not change, but she saw the slight tightening of his jaw. He held out his hands. The sheriff tied Eli's wrists in front of him. The sight of the bound man seemed to embolden the crowd. They pressed closer, the circle tightening like a noose. Henry Talcott stepped forward. The sound of his crutch hitting the hard-packed earth was rhythmic and ominous. Thud. Step. Thud. Step. He stopped 5 feet from Eli. The two men looked at each other, the crippled landowner and the bound drifter. The fence that had separated them all summer was gone, replaced by this raw, public confrontation. "I will speak," Henry said. The crowd quieted. Henry Talcott was a pillar of the valley. He was a veteran. He was a man who had built a ranch from nothing. "I have watched this man all summer," Henry began, his voice carrying to the back of the crowd. "I built a fence to keep my property safe, to keep my wife safe, and all summer. This man has tested it." He pointed a shaking finger at Eli. "I have seen him riding my line at odd hours. Dawn, midnight. I have seen him stopping where he has no business stopping, sneaking around like a coyote looking for a way into the coop." "That is a lie," Eli said quietly. "I never crossed your line." "Talcott, you crossed it with your eyes." Henry spat. "And you crossed it with your intent. You think we do not know your kind? You drift in here with your sad stories and your empty pockets. You see men who have worked for 20 years to build something, and you think you are entitled to a piece of it." Henry turned to the crowd, his face twisted with a mixture of pain and righteous performance. "He was at my fence 2 nights ago," Henry declared. "The night before the raid at Miller's place. I saw him. He was scouting. He was looking for the weak points. And he was not alone. He had an accomplice. Someone he has twisted and fooled," the crowd muttered darkly. "An accomplice? Who?" "He is a cancer," Henry roared, his voice cracking. "He steals cattle, yes, but he steals more than that. He steals the peace of this valley. He steals the trust between neighbors, and he killed that boy as surely as if he held the rock himself. Because he is the one who opened the gate for the devil to walk in. Hang him!" a voice shouted. "String him up!" The mob surged forward. The sheriff held up his hands, looking terrified. "Now hold on, boys, we need proof." "Proof?" Henry laughed. A harsh, jagged sound. "Look at him. Sheriff, he is a man without a home. He is a man without a covenant. What more proof do you need?" Clara felt the world tilting. The heat, the dust, the roar of the crowd. It all swirled into a sickening vortex. She looked at Eli. He was standing alone in the center of the hatred, his hands bound, his head high. He was not looking at the mob. He was looking at her. His eyes were pleading, not for his life, but for her silence. "Stay there," his eyes said. "Let me take this. Go back to your life." Clara looked at Henry. She saw the triumph in his face. He was not just killing a rival. He was purifying his world. He was going to watch Eli hang, and then he was going to take Clara home and lock the door. And they would live out their days in the gray silence of his victory. The cage of expectations that had held her for 2 years, the whispers of the church women, the heavy hand of her husband, the crushing weight of being a proper wife, suddenly felt flimsy. It was made of fear. And looking at Eli, Clara realized she had run out of fear. She stepped out of the shadows. "Stop!" Her voice was not a scream. It was a command. It rang out with the clarity of a bell in the heavy air. The crowd turned. Men lowered their voices. Women craned their necks. Clara Talcott was walking toward the center of the circle. She held her head up. Her face was pale, but her steps were steady. Henry turned, his eyes widening. "Go back to the wagon, Clara," he warned, his voice low and dangerous. "This is men's business." "No," Clara said. She walked past him. She walked until she was standing next to Eli. She could smell the sweat and dust on him. She could feel the heat of his body. She turned to face the town. She saw Mrs. Gable, her mouth open in shock. She saw the banker. She saw the faces of people she had known for 2 years, people who thought they knew her. "You want to know where Eli Mercer was 2 nights ago?" Clara asked. Her voice trembled, then firmed up. "You want to know why he was at the fence?" "Clara, do not do this," Eli whispered. "Hush," she said softly to him. She looked at the sheriff. He was not scouting for rustlers. Sheriff, and he was not alone. "Henry is right about that. He was with someone." "Who?" Miller demanded. "Who was he with?" "He was with me," Clara said. A silence fell over the livery yard. It was a silence so profound it felt like the air had been sucked out of the valley. "He was with me," Clara repeated, louder this time. "At the fence, and the night of the storm. The night the cattle were taken. He was not cutting wire. He was in the line shack. With me." A gasp rippled through the women. "Mrs." Gable covered her mouth with a gloved hand. The men stared, their mouths slack. Henry stood frozen. His face had gone the color of old ash. "He is not a thief," Clara said, the tears finally starting to spill, hot and fast. "And he is not a killer. He is a man who listened when no one else would. He is a man who showed me kindness when this valley showed me only hard work and silence." She turned to Henry. "I am the accomplice. Henry, if he is guilty of stealing, then he stole my heart. But he did not take it. I gave it to him because I was starving." "Adultery," someone hissed. The word hung in the air like a curse. "Shame, Mrs." Miller cried out. "Have you no shame, woman?" Henry made a sound. It was a guttural, animal noise that came from the bottom of his chest. It was the sound of a man whose entire world, his pride, his name, his control, had just been incinerated in front of the people he sought to impress. He dropped his crutch. He did not need it. Rage fueled him. He lunged at Eli. "You son of a bitch!" Henry screamed. He crashed into Eli, tackling the bound man. They hit the dirt hard. The crowd surged back, shouting. Henry was on top of him, striking him with his fists. Eli, his hands tied, tried to roll, tried to defend himself, but Henry was insane with fury. "He took her!" Henry screamed, landing a blow to Eli's jaw that split the skin. "You took her from me!" "Henry!" Clara screamed, grabbing at Henry's coat. "Stop it!" She tried to pull him off, but he shoved her back with a sweep of his arm, sending her stumbling into the dust. Henry reached into his coat. The glint of metal flashed in the twilight. "A revolver! He is going to kill him!" Clara shrieked. Sheriff Brady lunged forward. "No, Henry, put it down!" Henry did not hear. He jammed the barrel of the gun against Eli's chest. His eyes were wide, unseeing, filled with the madness of total loss. "You will not have her," Henry hissed. "You will not." Eli brought his bound hands up in a desperate, violent arc, knocking Henry's arm aside just as the trigger broke. Bang! The gunshot was deafening. A cloud of gray smoke bloomed between them. Both men froze. For a heartbeat. No one moved. Then, slowly, Henry Talcott slumped forward. The gun slipped from his fingers. He made a small, surprised sound, like a man remembering something he had forgotten. He rolled off Eli and lay on his back in the dirt. A dark stain was spreading rapidly across the front of his vest, just below the heart, The bullet, deflected in the struggle, had found the one man in the crowd who had wanted violence most. "Henry," Clara whispered. She crawled to him. The crowd was silent, frozen in the tableau of the tragedy. Henry looked up at the sky, which was turning a bruised purple. He looked at Clara. His eyes were losing their focus, the hardness fading into a vast, empty confusion. "The fence," he whispered, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. It didn't hold. His breath rattled in his chest. A long, shuddering exhale, and then he was still. The dust began to settle around his body. Sheriff Brady was the first to move. He stepped forward, his face pale, and checked Henry's neck. He stood up slowly and took off his hat. "He is dead." The words broke the spell. The mob, which moments ago had been ready to hang a man, now looked at the body of their neighbor with horror. They looked at Eli, who was sitting up in the dirt, his face bruised, his hands still bound, breathing hard, and they looked at Clara, kneeling in the blood of her husband. This is an accident," the sheriff stammered, his voice shaking. He drew the weapon. It went off in the struggle. He looked at the crowd, finding his authority in the wreckage. "There will be no hanging today. Go home, all of you. Go home to your families." The crowd dispersed slowly, muttering, looking back over their shoulders. They did not look at Eli with anger anymore. They looked at Clara with something worse: judgment. As the women walked away, Clara saw them pulling their skirts aside as if she were contagious. She heard the words drifting back: faithless, harlot, blood on her hands. The preacher, Reverend Thomas, lingered for a moment. He looked down at Clara, his face hard as flint. "You have made your bed, Mrs. Talcott," he said coldly. "I pray you find peace in it, but you will not find it in this town." He turned and walked away. Eli struggled to his feet. The sheriff cut his bonds with a knife, his hands trembling. "You are free to go." "Mercer," the sheriff said, not meeting his eyes. "We have the testimony. You were occupied when the rustling happened." He looked at the body of Henry Talcott. "But do not stay long. The mood will turn again. Grief turns to anger fast in this heat." "I understand," Eli said. The sheriff called for the undertaker's wagon, then retreated to his office. Eli stood in the darkening street. He walked over to Clara. She was still kneeling, staring at Henry's face. She reached out and gently closed his eyes, her hand stained with his blood. "Clara," Eli said softly. She stood up. She looked at the town that was closing its doors against her. Windows were being shuttered. The boardwalks were empty. She was a widow, and she was an outcast. She looked at Eli. His lip was split, his eyes swelling. He looked at her not with triumph, but with a profound, aching sorrow. He knew what she had done. She had traded her good name for his life. "Take me home, Eli," she whispered. They buried Henry 3 days later on the rise behind the ranch house. It was a dry, lonely spot that overlooked the valley. The turnout was sparse. A few neighbors came out of duty, but they stood far back from Clara. They did not offer condolences. They watched her with cold curiosity, as if she were a strange species of animal they had not seen before. Reverend Thomas read the service quickly, the pages of his Bible flapping in the wind. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes. When the last shovel of dry earth hit the pine box, the neighbors left. They rode away without looking back, their wagons kicking up plumes of dust that drifted over the fresh grave. Clara stood by the mound. She was wearing a black dress she had dyed herself. It smelled of vinegar and dye. Eli stood by the gate. He had packed his bedroll. His horse was saddled. Clara turned away from the grave. She walked down the hill to the house. It felt empty. The silence that Henry had cultivated was gone, replaced by a hollow echo. The ledger on the table was closed. The rifle was gone. She did not go inside. She walked to the barn and saddled her mare. She packed a single saddlebag with clothes, a tin of coffee, and the small daguerreotype of her father. She left the china. She left the furniture. She left the deed to the land on the kitchen table. She led the mare out. Eli was waiting. They rode to the east line. To the fence. The wire was still tight. The cedar posts still stood like soldiers. The fence glinted under the unrelenting sun, a monument to a man who had believed that control was the only way to survive. Eli dismounted. He walked to his saddlebag and pulled out a pair of heavy wire cutters. He looked at Clara. She nodded. Eli walked to the fence. He gripped the top strand of the barbed wire with the jaws of the cutter. He squeezed. Ping! The wire snapped, curling back violently. The sound was like a gunshot, but cleaner. He cut the second strand. Ping! He cut the third. Ping! The tension broke. The wire fell limp to the ground. Eli kicked the loose ends aside, opening a gap in the barrier, a 10-foot-wide door into the open range. He mounted his horse. Clara looked back at the ranch one last time. She saw the small house, the barn, and the fresh mound of earth on the hill. She felt the grief of the years she had lost there, but she also felt the wind on her face. It was no longer a wind that scoured. It was a wind that carried the scent of sage and distance. She looked at Eli. He was bruised, scarred, and he had nothing to offer her but the horizon. But he was looking at her with a love that did not try to own her. "Ready?" he asked. "Yes," Clara said. They rode through the gap in the fence, side by side. They did not look back. They turned their horses toward the mountains, where the snow still held a promise of water. The sun beat down on the valley. The wind blew through the gap in the wire, singing a low, mournful song. The fence posts remained, a line of wood marching across the dry earth. But in time, the posts would lean. The wire would rust. The staples would pull free. The land did not care about fences. It only cared about those who had the courage to cross them. And as Clara and Eli disappeared into the vast, shimmering distance, the open land ahead held a faint glimmer of hope, a future where their love, born in the harshest soil and watered with blood and tears, might finally grow without bars between them. Thank you for listening to this story. It has been a journey through the dust and the heartache of the American West, and I hope Clara and Eli's story resonated with you. I would love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please leave a comment below and share your location. If you enjoyed this tale of love, loss, and the open range, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. We have many more stories to tell from the frontier, and please, share your thoughts on the ending in the comments in English. Did they make the right choice? I look forward to reading your words. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon.